Security stopped me mid-click. My cursor hovered over the approval field when the screen locked and the reimbursement froze at $3,200. I was fired for a $3,200 mistake, not $1 million, not fraud. $3,200. I was correcting it. The charge had been logged, disclosed, and queued for adjustment, the kind of routine cleanup my role existed to do. The system showed my notes, my timestamps, my fix waiting on approval. Then everything went gray. Permissions gone, access revoked, my name blinking red where it shouldn't. The CEO's assistant didn't whisper. She stood beside my desk and said, "The decision's final. Financial misconduct, no meeting followed, no HR voice, no questions, just a label dropped like a stamp." I'm Michael Turner, Senior Risk and Compliance Manager, the person hired to stop small numbers from growing teeth. I slow people down. I ask for proof. I make executives uncomfortable before regulators do. Richard Hale, our CEO, prefers speed. He believes fast firings look decisive, especially when a dollar figure sounds bad enough to sell the story. My chest tightened as the word misconduct echoed. 3,200 wasn't the problem. It never was. What scared them lived behind it, a trail that began with one reimbursement and ended with disclosures no one wanted read aloud. I knew the pattern because I'd built the controls to catch it. They slid termination papers across the desk before I could finish my explanation. I signed because the outcome was already chosen. When I returned the pen, the company lawyer hesitated half a beat, eyes flicking to a paragraph he wished weren't there. That pause spoke louder than any apology. I stood up, numb and focused at once. My contract didn't allow verdicts before investigations. They hadn't solved a risk. They'd documented one. And as I walked out, I understood the mistake wasn't mine at all. Somewhere behind me. Phones started ringing, and I felt the quiet certainty that a rushed label would soon collide with procedures designed to remember everything. They had mistaken speed for control, and numbers forget. How does that sit with you right now? Did it make you tense up? Or just quietly angry like it did to me if you're at home? Try turning on a small lamp or changing the room light for a moment. It's a simple shift, but it can steady your mood more than you'd expect. Let me know where you're listening from. I always like picturing the places these stories land. Stay with me. And if this feels real to you, consider subscribing, because what happened next is where the silence finally started to cost them. The email hit my inbox before I reached the parking lot. Terminated for financial misconduct, $3,200. That single line traveled faster than truth ever does. By the time I sat in my car, the label had already hardened into fact, and my name had become a warning others would quietly step away from. Within hours, every internal channel went dark. My company phone stopped syncing. Slack locked me out. Even my calendar disappeared, as if erasing future meetings could rewrite the past. A routine accounting correction was now framed as an ethical failure. $3,200 had been reshaped into a character flaw. Something whispered with raised eyebrows and lowered voices. The humiliation came in layers. Former teammates avoided eye contact. One sent a careful message wishing me the best before deleting it seconds later. I understood the choreography. When leadership says misconduct, people protect themselves by believing it. Doubt becomes dangerous. Silence feels safer. What made it worse was memory. I couldn't stop replaying the times I had prevented real damage. I had halted payments that would have triggered six-figure penalties. I'd flagged reporting inconsistencies before they reached regulators. I'd spent years being the quiet friction in the system, the person who slowed momentum just enough to keep the company intact. None of that mattered once my name fit the narrative they needed. Richard Hale needed proof that he was decisive. The board wanted reassurance that risk had been contained. A fast firing with a neat dollar figure looked like control. It didn't matter that the number was small or already addressed. What mattered was having a person to point at, a file to close, A story that ended cleanly before questions could open wider doors. I felt the anger settle into something heavier than rage. It was the weight of being used. They didn't just remove me, they reassigned meaning to my work, my intent, my reputation, by labeling the issue financial misconduct. They transformed a process correction into a moral failing, and in doing so, insulated themselves from looking further. Late that evening, as the noise finally quieted, a message came through from outside the company. A senior contact at our largest partner didn't bother with pleasantries. Why was the compliance lead removed over a minor adjustment? The question wasn't accusatory. It was confused. And in that confusion, I felt the first shift. If they were asking, others would too. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. For the first time since the email spread, the story was no longer entirely in their hands. I sat there, humiliated and furious, realizing they hadn't erased risk at all. They had simply moved it, wrapped it in paperwork, and sent it quietly downstream, hoping no one would notice the current changing direction yet. I didn't sleep that night, not from panic, but from clarity. When noise fades, details surface, and contracts speak best in silence. I opened my employment agreement at the kitchen table, the same document I had skimmed years earlier and trusted to memory. This time I read it the way auditors read numbers slowly, without hope. Page after page confirmed what they thought I was: replaceable, terminable, contained. Then I reached the clause they had forgotten existed. It wasn't dramatic, no bold font, no warning label, just a paragraph titled, "Termination Triggered Liability," written in the dull language lawyers use when they expect adults to pay attention. The words were precise. If an employee was terminated for financial misconduct before an independent investigation concluded, the company assumed full responsibility for any related exposure. Not shared, not disputed, assumed. The logic was simple. If leadership rushed judgment, leadership owned the outcome. Reading it didn't make me smile. It slowed my breathing instead. They had fired me publicly, decisively, and incorrectly. They had used the phrase financial misconduct like a stamp, skipping the investigation that gave that stamp meaning. By doing so, they didn't just accuse me, they classified the issue as systemic. That mattered more than intent ever could. I closed the document and sat still. This wasn't leverage I could wave around or threaten with. It wasn't a trap I had set. It was a rule they had agreed to follow and chose to ignore. The calm came from understanding that nothing more was required of me. There's a lesson professionals learn late, usually after paying for it. Silence, when backed by process, is not weakness, it is restraint. I didn't need to email legal or warn the board. Alerting them would only give them time to reframe, revise, or quietly retreat. Consequences work best when uninterrupted. So I did nothing. I declined calls, I didn't clarify timelines, I let the record stand exactly as they created it. Their decision, their language, their speed. My role ended the moment they said it did. And with it, ended my obligation to protect them from themselves. As the house settled into early morning quiet, I understood something else. They believed they had contained risk by removing me. In reality, they had detached the one person whose job was to absorb impact before it spread. The clause wasn't punishment, it was gravity. And once triggered, gravity doesn't need help to finish its work. I stayed calm because panic would have warned them. Calm let events align without interference. I trusted documentation, timestamps, and their own signatures more than any argument I could make. Sometimes the most strategic move is to step aside and allow systems to reveal what leadership tried to hide. That patience costs nothing up front, but collects interest later. Quietly, inevitably, always. If you understand the true meaning of this passage, please comment one sentence: silence changed shape once other people entered it. By the second morning after my termination, questions arrived from outside the building I was no longer allowed to enter. A partner asked for clarification. politely at first, about accountability surrounding a $3,200 adjustment. They weren't accusatory. They were careful, which meant they were documenting. The company responded faster than I expected. Not with analysis, not with context. They sent my termination letter. The same document stamped with financial misconduct and my name, forwarded as proof that the issue had been addressed. In one move, they turned a personnel action into an official statement. I watched this unfold from a distance, resisting every impulse to intervene. Each instinct from my old job screamed to correct the framing, to explain the process, to limit exposure. I ignored all of it. Silence was no longer passive. It was structural, by labeling my removal as remediation. Leadership unintentionally did something irreversible. They confirmed the problem wasn't procedural confusion or timing. They confirmed fault. And by acting before an investigation, they confirmed ownership. The document they shared wasn't just a record of dismissal. It was evidence. The waiting became heavy. I checked my phone less often, but when it buzzed, my pulse still jumped. I knew how partners read signals like this. A fast answer without substance raises more questions than it settles. Internally. I could imagine the scramble compliance manuals pulled from shelves, old emails re-examined, conversations replayed with new caution. I stayed quiet, not out of fear, but discipline. Speaking would have diluted the clarity of what they had already said for me. Their speed, their language, their confidence, all of it stood on paper now, untouched by my voice. Late that afternoon, something shifted. A message reached me indirectly from a former colleague in legal. There was going to be a closed meeting. Senior counsel only. No executive assistants, no calendar invites that left trails, and notably, no CEO. That detail tightened everything when lawyers meet without leadership. It means narratives are no longer holding. It means consequences are being measured instead of managed. I felt the tension sharpen into focus, not panic, but anticipation. I understood then that silence hadn't stalled the story. It had accelerated it in a direction no one had planned. The evidence was complete because it was uncontested. All I had done was step aside. They had done the rest themselves. That realization kept my hands steady and my mouth closed. The process was moving exactly as written, indifferent to intentions or excuses. I didn't feel relief yet, only controlled suspense, the kind that sits quietly, counting implications, knowing the next document would land harder than any argument I could have made without ever raising my voice or asking anyone for permission. Again, anywhere pressure didn't announce itself loudly. It crept in through numbers that suddenly mattered. The $47 million figure surfaced quietly, mentioned first in a clipped message forwarded by someone who shouldn't have been looping so many people in. Once a number that large appears, it changes posture, tone, and breath across an entire organization. The contract was clear. I had reviewed it myself months earlier while building risk matrices for that partnership. One clause sat near the middle, unemotional and exact. If a systemic financial breach was confirmed, the partner had the right to withdraw without penalty. No arbitration delay, no goodwill extension, just exit. At the time, it felt theoretical. Now it felt immediate. By firing me for financial misconduct, the company had done more than remove an employee. They had classified the issue. Systemic wasn't defined by size, it was defined by responsibility. Their own paperwork said the failure wasn't isolated, it was structural. And that classification traveled faster than any explanation could. I imagined the meeting where someone finally read the clause aloud. Someone would have said, "Wait, does this apply?" Another voice would answer, "It already does." Silence would follow, heavy and exact. $47 million doesn't need embellishment to command attention. Phones started ringing that evening, not to me, but around me. Former colleagues asked careful questions that weren't really questions. "Do you know what they're thinking?" "Have you heard anything?" I answered none of them. Every response would only blur lines that were now painfully sharp. Then the notice arrived. Formal, polite, devastating. The partner exercised their right to withdraw due to a confirmed systemic financial breach. The language mirrored the termination letter almost word for word. That symmetry wasn't accidental. It was legal alignment. I read the notice twice, then once more slowly. My name wasn't mentioned. It didn't need to be. The decision had outgrown me. What began as a $3,200 correction had expanded into something that filled boardrooms and calendars. Inside the company, pressure collapsed inward. Leadership scrambled for reinterpretations, for alternative explanations. But contracts don't respond to urgency. They respond to definitions. And the company had already defined the problem in writing. I felt the tension release slightly, replaced by a steady weight, not relief, gravity. This wasn't victory. It was consequence moving at contractual speed. I hadn't pulled any levers. I hadn't argued my case. I had simply stepped back and allowed their decisions to speak uninterrupted. Many people listen past this part. But if you stayed, you know it matters. They didn't stop once the contract snapped shut. When 47 million evaporates, someone always looks for a human face to pin it on. Richard Hale chose mine. Emails resurfaced, forwarded with selective outrage, threads from years ago, stripped of context, highlighted as if intention could be retroactively manufactured. A sentence here, a cautionary note there. This shows independent judgment. Someone wrote, hoping repetition could become truth. I read it all without surprise. This was the predictable turn. The moment leadership abandoned systems and hunts personalities. If they could make it my personal failure, the breach might shrink back into a misunderstanding. That was the theory. What they ignored was structure. Every process they accused me of misusing had been drafted, reviewed, and approved in formal committees. My emails referenced policy numbers, sign-offs, and documented thresholds. I hadn't acted independently. I had acted exactly as instructed, repeatedly, in writing. The irony burned clean and sharp. The same executives now circling my inbox had once praised that caution as diligence. Now they needed recklessness. So diligence became defiance. I felt anger. Yes, but it carried a bitter humor. Watching leadership attempt to outrun its own paper trail is almost educational. Behind the scenes, the tone shifted again. What began as blame quietly turned into inventory. Requests expanded, logs, approvals, archived reports. The company wasn't just defending a decision anymore. It was mapping exposure. That was when the next notice landed. Audit scope expanded, not targeted, comprehensive. Every system tied to financial classification, reporting flow, and escalation control. The very framework I had built was now under a microscope. I couldn't help the irony that followed. They fired the person who knew where the weak seams were, then asked strangers to pull on everything at once. Anger gave way to a colder satisfaction, not triumph, confirmation. They tried to make it personal because systems don't flinch. But systems remember. And once auditors start asking how decisions were approved, personalities stop mattering at all. I imagined Hale leaning over conference tables, insisting the problem was me, not policy. That kind of leadership always confuses authorship with accountability. They believed intent could override documentation, that enough emphasis might bend procedure. Instead, procedure bent them. The deeper the audit went, the clearer the chain became, linking signatures to outcomes without emotion. My name faded from the center as process took over, line by line. What remained was a company arguing with its own records, discovering too late that blaming a person does nothing when the system itself is testifying. That realization carried a sharp, almost mocking edge. I wasn't being investigated anymore. The organization was. Every approval I'd once chased for safety now returned as evidence. The anger stayed, but it sharpened into irony, because the harder they searched for my motive, the more clearly they exposed their own. By then, blame felt small compared to watching consequences unfold with mechanical precision in silence. You can't undo a firing. I understood that before the call came, which made the call almost polite. Richard Hale's assistant asked if I was available to talk. The word sounded smaller than the situation deserved. I agreed, not out of hope, but curiosity. When Richard's voice came on, it was softer than I remembered. He spoke about context, about how things looked, about the possibility of updating records to better reflect intent. He never said the word apology. He circled it like a risk he didn't want to trigger. I listened without interrupting. The request became clearer with each sentence. They wanted to revise the reason for my termination, remove the phrase financial misconduct, replace it with something procedural and harmless. In exchange, there would be a consulting offer, temporary, quiet, generous enough to sound respectful. When he paused, waiting for relief, I gave him one sentence. You already documented your answer. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain. There was nothing to negotiate. A firing is not a draft, once recorded. It stops belonging to intent and starts belonging to evidence. The line went quiet. I could hear him recalculating, realizing the window had closed days earlier. I felt no rush of victory, only a steady satisfaction that comes from watching gravity work. The system doesn't care about regret. It cares about timestamps. There's a lesson here that isn't taught in leadership seminars. Speed creates permanence. Decisions made to look strong rarely age well. That thought settled as I ended the call and put my phone down. By the end of the week, the market noticed what internal meetings couldn't contain. The stock dipped, then slid, then kept falling. Analysts used neutral language: uncertainty, exposure, governance concerns, but the direction was unmistakable. Confidence drains faster than capital once credibility cracks. I watched the numbers without emotion, not because I wanted them to fall, but because they were finally behaving honestly. The price reflected what leadership tried to outrun. Every attempt to rewrite the past only highlighted how firmly it was already written. I didn't celebrate. I didn't comment. I stayed cold, quietly satisfied, knowing that some consequences can't be reversed, only acknowledged. A firing is one of them, and the market understands finality better than any executive ever will. That understanding steadied me more than anger ever could. I wasn't rooting for collapse. I was respecting sequence, actions, records, reactions. When leaders confuse reversal with repair, they only deepen damage. The quiet satisfaction came from alignment, not revenge. The outcome was simply the cost of choosing optics over process and letting paperwork speak when voices should have listened. It ended there, complete and irreversible, exactly as contracts always intend. The board meeting didn't feel dramatic from the outside. No raised voices reached me. No leaks hit the press. What changed was tone. Conversation slowed. Language tightened. When boards stop reacting and start parsing, justice usually isn't far behind. I wasn't invited. That was the first sign things had shifted. For weeks. Every discussion about the fallout circled my name. Now it didn't. I learned later that my file stayed closed on the table, untouched, while attention moved elsewhere. That absence mattered. According to a former colleague who quietly filled in the gaps, the opening question wasn't accusatory. It was surgical. One director leaned forward and asked, why was a $3,200 issue handled like a felony? No one answered immediately. That silence did more than any defense ever could. The question reframed everything. Not whether I made a mistake, not whether the termination followed policy, but why leadership escalated something routine into moral failure without investigation. The board wasn't hunting a scapegoat. They were examining judgment. Richard Hale tried to respond with confidence. He spoke about optics, about decisive action, about setting standards. The words sounded rehearsed, polished for exactly this kind of moment, but the board didn't interrupt him because they were already past rhetoric. One director asked who approved the language in my termination letter. Another asked whether legal had signed off before or after it was sent externally. Someone else asked why compliance controls were bypassed instead of reviewed. Each question landed quietly, building weight. What struck me most was what they didn't ask. No one questioned my intent. No one reviewed my emails. No one debated my character. They treated the situation like what it had always been, a governance failure, not an employee one. When the vote came, it wasn't dramatic either. It was procedural, effective immediately. Richard Hale was suspended pending further review. Interim leadership would take over. The motion passed without debate. I felt something release in my chest when I heard. Not relief exactly, but alignment. The system had finally examined itself instead of pointing outward. That's what justice looks like in organizations, not punishment, but correction. The meeting ended quickly after that. There was nothing left to argue. The question had done its work. A $3,200 adjustment hadn't destroyed a career. A decision to weaponize it had. I didn't celebrate. I sat quietly, letting the realization settle. Justice hadn't arrived with noise or apology. It arrived with clarity. When the board finally asked the right question and followed it to its logical conclusion, the fallout didn't arrive with fireworks. It settled slowly, like dust after a collapse, coating everything that moved and everything that pretended it hadn't. The $47 million loss was confirmed in a bland filing, buried under neutral language that couldn't hide the damage. The partnership was gone. The money was gone. What remained was time. Auditors stayed. Then more auditors arrived, calendars filled with interviews, document requests, reconciliations that reached back years. Nothing dramatic, just relentless. The kind of scrutiny that drains confidence drop by drop inside the company. Productivity slowed, not from fear, but exhaustion. Every decision now waited for 3 approvals and a legal footnote. Richard Hale didn't fight when his resignation was announced. There was no farewell message, no reflection, no attempt to reframe history. He exited the way many executives do when stories stop bending in their favor quietly, hoping silence might soften memory. It didn't. People expected me to sue. Friends asked which firm I'd use, what settlement would look like. I never called anyone. I had nothing to prove and no appetite for spectacle. Litigation would have turned consequence into theater. The process had already done what it was designed to do. There's a calm that follows when accountability finally lands where it belongs. Not joy, not triumph, just equilibrium. I watched from the outside as the audit stretched on, month after month, reshaping roles, rewriting procedures, exposing how fragile speed looks under light. Then, the call came from the partner who had walked away. Not an apology, not an explanation. An offer. They wanted someone who understood controls without dramatizing them, someone who didn't confuse caution with weakness. They remembered who had built the safeguards they now valued. I listened, asked questions, took my time. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The same $3,200 issue that ended my job had clarified my worth. When I accepted, it felt less like a win and more like continuation. No revenge was required. The company paid what it chose to risk. The audit concluded when it concluded. Leadership changed. Systems adjusted. I moved on without dragging anyone behind me. Some stories end with confrontation. This one ended with alignment. The right people asked the right questions, and the answers carried weight without my voice. That was enough. I closed that chapter without bitterness, understanding that consequences don't need anger to be complete. They only need time, structure, and the patience to let records speak louder than outrage ever could. That quiet resolution stayed with me. It reminded me that restraint can be more powerful than retaliation, and that letting systems function as written preserves dignity on both sides. I didn't need vindication shouted aloud. The absence of noise was proof enough that balance had been restored without further personal cost. I started my new role quietly, without announcements or victory laps. The office was smaller, calmer, and built around process instead of urgency. My responsibility was clear protect systems before personalities interfered. It felt familiar, but steadier, like returning to principles instead of a company, from a distance. The old firm continued to unwind. Richard Hale's name faded from earnings calls, industry panels, and press releases. No scandal followed him, just absence. In corporate life, disappearance is often the final verdict. People moved on, policies replaced him, and memory did the rest. What stayed with me wasn't anger or triumph, it was clarity. I had watched how quickly leadership mistook speed for strength and punishment for control. Firing someone didn't erase exposure, it simply reassigned it upward, where decisions are supposed to live. That lesson followed me into every meeting. When numbers looked ugly, we slowed down. When someone demanded action without context, we asked for documentation. Not because we feared blame, but because we respected consequence. Governance isn't about stopping mistakes, it's about handling them without panic. The story ended the way most real ones do. Without applause, a company lost $47 million, a CEO lost relevance. I gained neither revenge nor apology. And I didn't need either. The system corrected itself once it was allowed to function. I tell this now because people still believe termination equals closure. It doesn't. It creates records, triggers clauses, and preserves decisions long after intent is forgotten. Responsibility doesn't vanish when you remove a person. It concentrates. Justice doesn't shout in boardrooms. It settles quietly, leaving rules intact, incentives real, and lessons unavoidable for anyone tempted to confuse decisiveness with leadership ever again under pressure or fear. They fired me over $3,200. It cost them $47 million. What this story taught me wasn't about revenge, contracts, or even money. It was about dignity under pressure. When you're humiliated, mislabeled, or quietly pushed aside, the instinct is to fight back immediately, to explain, to defend, to prove your worth. But sometimes the most human thing you can do is stay steady and let truth move at its own pace. Systems eventually reveal who acted out of fear and who acted with care. People don't always remember what you said in the moment, but they remember how you carried yourself when things were unfair. There's also a quieter lesson here. Your value doesn't disappear just because someone in power decides you're inconvenient. Being removed doesn't erase contribution. Being silenced doesn't cancel integrity. And being calm in chaos is not weakness, it's strength refined by experience. Did you stay with me until the end? If you did, I'd really like to hear your story. Have you ever been blamed for something that wasn't truly yours? Or watched consequences unfold without you lifting a finger? Tell me where you're listening from, too. Reading those places always reminds me how shared these moments are. If this story resonated, leave a comment, tap like, share it with someone who might need it, and consider subscribing. Stories like this are just beginning.